We're now going to continue creating a storm-like atmosphere for this scene. And if you want to start at the point I'm at right now, it is landscape with distant terrains, atmosphere edited, or atmosphere edit 2. So what I want to do is darken up the scene a bit more, create more of a dense haze with not so much saturation in the color. I'm just going to adjust the camera angle a little so we can see more of the terrain. Go into the atmosphere editor, and one extremely impactful lighting setting is the ambient light color, which affects the entire scene along with the clouds, and it's going to make a huge difference. Right now we have a very pale look to the scene, where there isn't really a whole lot of contrast, and most of that's being subtracted by the atmospherics, and it's being lit all over by the ambient lighting. So if we take the ambient light color and make it black, so RGB 0, we're going to end up with a very high contrast look. And now overall the entire scene is much darker, and there's a much more distribution of light. Or less distribution of light, I should say. If we open up the post-render options and now we can adjust the exposure, we'll be able to get some very light areas along with some very dark clouds. And if you take a look at the natural film response, turning it on and off, the area around the sun is much crisper. So whether or not you want to have that natural film response fade, it's of course up to you. I'm going to keep it on just for now. And what I want to do is reduce some of the horizon color and make it a little grayer. So in the atmosphere editor, Sky, Fog, and Haze, I'm going to start by reducing some of the saturation amounts of the sky color and the decay color. So we'll go ahead and take the sky color, right-click, edit the color, and taking the left slider, we could reduce the saturation. If you want to store your current color, you can just click on it and drag it over into the favorites section. If you edit favorites, it'll allow you to increase the amount of columns if you want to have more of a color palette available, which is pretty cool. So then we click OK when we're done, and we can already see a nice desaturation. Go into the decay color and do basically the same thing, making it more of a darker brown, so really making a lot of the color disappear. We could also take that and bring it a little more towards green. And then if we need to, we can also increase the haze density. If we need to, we can darken that up. Also, reducing the sky ground density will remove more of the thickness of the atmosphere and also darken it up a little bit more. So with that rendered out, the post-render options open, if we take a look at the natural film response, because we have such a high peak around the horizon, we may need to turn the option off. If we take a look, turning on with a higher exposure, that might be necessary in order to really spread that out. But right now, with that much haze being the color that it is, it's lit up a little bit too much. I want something much darker, and we need to make a few modifications in order to really balance this all out. So one thing we can do is reduce the glow intensity, which is the overall spreading of light throughout the entire scene. It affects the atmosphere as well as the terrain. If we need to reduce the aerial perspective, we can reduce the overall density of the entire atmosphere. We can also start to use the fog layer density. And I'm going to go ahead and take the fog altitude, mean altitude, and set it to 500 meters. And then we can start to increase the density, and I'm going to take the color and really bring it down more towards black. So we've got it at 17 for the RGB all the way across. Because that back area is still a little too light, we can start to increase the fog a little more until we eventually kind of black that out. Now what's happening at the moment is, even though the fog color is set nearly black, it is in fact lightening the scene. So let's bring it all the way down to black to make a complete subtraction and see if that will fix it. If not, we need to bring the haze color down, because they do often work hand in hand and can produce some varied results depending on certain settings within the scene. So let's go ahead and also take the haze color. We're going to go ahead and edit it. And if you want to keep it, you can drag it out into your color palette, and I'm going to reduce the overall output to something much darker, which should now in fact start to really darken the scene. If not, we can also increase the scattering probably from 0.82 up to 0.9, something a little bit higher, and that way it'll concentrate the light more around the sun, editing the cloud scattering as well. Now we are subtracting possibly too much light from the terrain. In fact, it's basically black at this point. So if we need to, we can move it a little more towards, so Atmosphere Editor, going to the Light tab, we can start to change the balance, moving it more towards sunlight, and then if we need to, we can just reduce the shadow intensity of the sunlight. I'm going to go ahead and leave the shadow intensity the way it is for the moment. So it's starting to look a little bit better, and this is just a preview render, so it doesn't look great. But it still gives you a pretty good idea. What I do want to go to is the Atmosphere Editor, take the size of the corona under the Sun tab and reduce that to around 20%. Also take the size of the Sun and bring it down to 1%. I do want to make the scene a little more eerie, so what I want to do is go to the Sky Fog and Haze tab and modify the sky color to make it a little more green. So we can edit the color and just kind of move it towards green and darken it up a bit. You can desaturate. Take both these colors, save them. Now, modifying these colors can have a huge impact on the scene. So we may need to kind of fine-tune it in order to get it to look right. But it does look like, so far in the preview render, it is kind of looking the way I wanted it to. And I think I'm going to reduce the fog density to lighten up the terrain, because that's possibly the reason why it's so dark. So we can take the fog and just reduce that to maybe about 10%. Now, one problem with the cloud layer is that too much light is shining through the clouds. We could use the God rays setting to block that out, but that's going to cause a lot of grain. So instead what I want to do is, as of view 7.5, there was a cloud scattering option added. If you increase that amount, what it'll do is cause the sun to shine more intensely where it is located rather than more of a distribution of the light. And now it's starting to look a little bit better, more of a concentration around where the sun is at. And if we need to, we can adjust the lighting on the ground If we need to enhance that, one thing we could do is go to the Light tab and increase the sky dome lighting gain. Of course, right now the overall sky color is so dim it might not really work efficiently, so we might need to increase the light balance, and then if you double-click on the sunlight, you can adjust the shadows. So if you wanted to bring that down to no shadows at all, it'll give you a pretty nice control. I'm going to go ahead and just kind of keep it the way it is right now, because I'm still making some adjustments to the scene. If we did want to further darken the clouds, at this point now we could use the density and really block out a lot of the light by doing so. Also going in to edit the material and making it closer to black. And that allows us to increase the exposure amount slightly higher to pick up overall lighting and have a nice dark cloud. We could also increase the sharpness of the cloud layer if you want to pull out some more fine highlights on the edges. Otherwise, you can reduce the amount. And if you want to see more detail on the bottoms, you can increase the uniform slider. Let's go ahead and increase the height, turn down the cover slightly, and I'm going to reduce the shadows just a little, turn off all the ambient lighting. By reducing the cover, I created more openings between the clouds, which is letting more light in. And by doing so, it is causing a little bit of grain because of the differences in contrast. And although it is helping with the look of the terrain, we might need to make further adjustments to reduce some of that grain. So we can edit the material, and I'm going to make it back towards uniform and reduce that sharpness, because we don't need it to be that high, and that's one of the contributing factors of the grain that is showing up. And we could just see a preview, kind of get an idea of the contrast. I do want to increase the decay amount now, because we have lost some of the coloration. So we can go ahead and increase the decay a little bit higher. Because it is so close to the original sky color, it's not going to reduce as intensely as it normally would. We can also increase the sky density to have an overall lightening and contrast. And then if we need to adjust haze, we can go ahead and modify that. Or if we want to pick up the haze higher, let's say we type in a value equal to the sky mean altitude, we're going to really block a lot out from the scene, but it will in fact create a really nice fall off around where the sun is at. Now, if you're having any further problems with grain, which is mostly going to show up around the areas with very minimal amounts of cloud, and like I was saying before, if it shows up in the preview render, it will still more than likely show up in the final render or broadcast or anything with a higher anti-aliasing quality. So what we need to do is reduce the cloud and some of those minimized amounts. So we're going to go into the filter for the density production and just kind of clamp it in the upper and lower value. Now we might have to modify the scale or the cover to get it to match up, but this is going to prevent the really small number amounts from coming out and producing all that grain when reacting with the detail layer. I'm also going to take the roughness and bring it down to 55%. If needed, I can modify the scales a little further. This should be a good start. Another way to make sure that we don't have some of those in-between values that are really transitioning between the cloud shapes. If we go back into that noise, I did have a reduction on the Z scale, 0.5, so we can set that to 1.5. And although it is going to modify the layer slightly, it's going to give us basically the same shape, but really make sure that overall everything's kind of cut out where it needs to be, and really saying the clouds are going to go here for sure, and not have as many in-between areas. And if we need to go back into the filter, we can modify that too, because it does look like there's still a few grain problems overall because of the contrast. Reducing the overall density will also help, because if we take a look, even with the auto exposure and increasing the exposure, this is a very dark scene at this point. So the grain is going to be hard to get rid of. So I'm going to reduce the density. If we have to, we can increase the height to go up a little bit higher and block out some of the light in those areas. I am going to increase the detail amount and maybe make it a little more uniform, and then if we want, we can crop this out a little bit more. Actually, we'll go ahead and bring in the lower value, which is going to really ensure that those lower portions, lower numbers, are completely removed. Now, another reason for the grain is because the height of the haze. So if we need to, we can also raise up the sky altitude to make sure that it's above the cloud layer and also above the haze, mainly making it so it's above the cloud layer. Decay amounts can sometimes have an impact like that as well. So after a few adjustments, primarily reducing the decay amount in order to brighten up the scene a little, and just making some modifications to the haze and lowering it to about 3 kilometers, reducing density. It is starting to look a little bit better. I do want to add another cloud layer just to have kind of a slightly lower cloud layer that's going to be a lot darker, create a nice contrast. So I'm going to add in, starting with the small cumulus. Click OK. This has been put on the top of the list because it is based on altitude. So if we lower the altitude to, let's say, 800 meters, it is going to show up much lower on the list, and based on the altitude amount. I'm going to reduce the height to a little over 100 meters, and then we can make some modifications to the scale. So I'm going to start by going to 0.1 for the scale, reduce detail amount, and then edit the material. Go to the volumetric color, set it to black, or as close to as possible. And now it does have a fractal running the density production, but first we'll go ahead and just take a look and see how well it shows up in the scene. So now we can see that nice dark cloud layer. What I want to do with this is reduce the cover. So now the small cumulus, which is those lower darker clouds, reduce the cover a little, and the altitude variations I want to bring down to 10%. I don't really want those altitude variations because they can cause some issues as of view 8. I'm not sure if it has to do with the way the filters have been changed, but sometimes it will cause some cutoffs at the tops of clouds, or without altitude variation in some cases there's a huge separation between the variation and the cloud layer itself. So sometimes you just gotta watch it. If you do notice a very flat area on the top of the cloud where it just looks like it's being sliced off, you may need to make some adjustments to the filters, kind of cutting it off early, either above or below 0, and then kind of fine-tuning from there. So this is a fairly interesting looking sky, a little closer to a storm. If we wanted to mix these two layers, we could just increase the height of the small cumulus, maybe increase cover, have a little variation that way. If you need to brighten the scene a little further, you can decrease the decay or increase the scattering a little, and then really crank up the glow intensity, which can produce some interesting effects. Sometimes it's hard to see until you render and take a look by adjusting the exposure. We'll go ahead and take a look at that. So now there's a little more brightness around the edges. I did increase the aerial perspective, which looks like it kind of cut out the ground because of the density of fog and haze layers. So if I bring down the aerial perspective to 1, we should see a lot less atmospheric density and be able to pull out more of the cloud shapes. So the more we reduce that amount, the less of that overall glow and some of the fog amounts are going to be seen. It also will control at the height of which cloud layers are going to be cut out or blend into the sky color. If you don't want to have that bright area for where the sun is, you just pretty much want to remove that. What you can do is remove the scattering, bring it down to a value closer to 0. 0 is going to be pretty much an overall distribution of light. So if we wanted to have it maybe 0.15, now the more we reduce this, the glow intensity has much more of an impact on the scene, along with the aerial perspective and the overall density of the atmosphere. So we do need to reduce the glow intensity if we're going to use a value this low in order to preserve the look of the scene without completely destroying everything. So now we have a much more even blend of light, probably a little more realistic for storm, although the way it is cutting out the terrain and that overall look may not be the best of looks. So we can adjust maybe the fog or haze, reducing the fog, if not get rid of it. We can also go into the light for the ambient color, and if we want to start adding a bit of tone towards one specific color, what I'm going to do is increase the green to 5 and the blue amount to 3, and then just add 1 for red. And that's going to give a very slight amount of color. It shouldn't be a huge impact, but it is going to help balance things out a little bit more. And then we can also adjust that cloud scattering, because that's also giving that appearance where the sun is really showing up behind those clouds. So what we can do is take the cloud scattering, bring it down to about 0.36, and that should really help disperse light as well. We may lose some of the definition, as you can see just in the preview already. Some of those more brightly lit areas are now removed once we reduce or basically diffuse the light by scattering it. If you find you're having to raise the exposure value too high to brighten the scene, kind of go into the atmosphere editor under the light tab and increase the light intensity. If the apply settings to all lights is checked on, it's going to affect every single light in the scene. So in other words, increasing their overall intensity. This is really the only way to increase the brightness of the sunlight for the overall scene. You can, after that, reduce the sunlight intensity by darkening the color of the sun. So if you select the sun in the aspect tab, the default color is, of course, white, because everything else is controlled by the volumetric. But you can darken the scene, basically making it completely black if you change the sunlight color to black, which would be pretty much no intensity whatsoever. At the moment, there is currently no cloud shadows between the layers. So if we want to, we can go to the Sky Fog and Haze tab, turn on the Project Shadows on Clouds, and this will take the top layer, the stratus layer, and cast a shadow onto the layer below it, which is going to increase the darkness of those clouds based on the shadow intensity of that top layer. So you can darken those clouds even further by doing that. If you want to have shadows within the atmosphere itself, you will need to use the volumetric lighting setting, or volumetric sunlight. And typically you'd use that with God rays, but it will require a much higher quality boost and is normally very grainy. So in this case, I'm not going to worry about that because we wouldn't really have that sort of a subtraction. Also, we do have a very bright horizon line. So if we go into the haze color, and let's bring this down, let's go ahead and do 4 all the way across, so it still doesn't have any saturation. It's just black and white, but we will be able to reduce that amount, and we're going to start to see more of that ambient light color when we do that as well. So now, even though it's a very slight difference between those colors, it does have a huge impact on the scene. So if you need to bring the ambient light color down back where it was, there's kind of a balance between that haze, because the ambient light illuminates the haze, and the ambient lighting of clouds, also fog, and in some cases the decay. And just since it is volumetric, it has a lot of impact pretty much everywhere. So these variations of the atmosphere are available if you want to load in the scenes. They are the storm variations of the atmosphere edit as part of the landscape with distant terrain. Now, if we wanted to go back to the original file, we can go to Atmosphere, Save Atmosphere, and just save it out, and then all you gotta do is load it into the other scene with the procedural terrains, and then you pretty much have your full scene.